The wind came low and hot across the Cimarron Cutoff, carrying with it the scent of alkali dust and mule sweat. The prairie was a bare, trembling sea, broken only by the long line of wagons crawling west toward the Sangre de Cristo. The wheels groaned like slow thunder, and every hoofprint filled with dust before it could cool. It was June of 1830, and the Santa Fe Trail lay open like a scar between two worlds, the trade towns of Missouri behind, and the Spanish hills of New Mexico ahead. Among that company of freighters and trappers rode Elias Boone Hardesty, a man of 30 years with the look of someone who had outlasted more winters than he could count. His rifle, a long-barreled J. Henry, rode easy across his saddle. His shirt was buckskin, sun-stiffened, and patched with sinew, and the broad hat shadowing his eyes had once been black, now faded to the color of the plains dust. Around his neck hung a deerskin pouch tied with a thong inside it. Wrapped in oilcloth and hope lay the thing that set him apart from the others, a yellowed scrap of parchment inked with the markings of a dying friar. The story of that map was already halfway legend by the time Hardesty reached the Arkansas crossing. Some said the friar had been part of the last Franciscan mission at Pecos Pueblo, driven out by hunger and raiding Comanches. Others swore he was a deserter from the Spanish mines at Santa Rosa who had buried silver for his sins. What Hardesty knew was this: the friar's last words, scrawled in a trembling Latin hand, spoke of Las Minas Perdidas, the lost mines of the Sangre de Cristo, a place where the stones bled red and the crucifixes were cast of native silver. At Bent's Fort, the newest stronghold on the Arkansas, he had tried to tell the story straight. But the traders there, men with hard eyes and harder laughter, heard lost mines and tasted only folly. "Best put that ghost map away, Elias," said William Bent, the younger of Contime, the Bent brothers, while stirring his coffee by the morning fire. "Ain't no silver worth dying of thirst for. Sangre de Cristo's just rock and snow and bad dreams." "I've heard worse trails than this one turn up true," Hardesty had answered. Bent grinned through the steam. "And I've buried men for less hope than that." The fort itself stood half-built against the riverbank, a great square of adobe walls rising from the sand. Inside, blacksmiths hammered at horseshoes, while trappers mended packs and restocked powder. Buffalo robes were stacked in towers, still heavy with the smell of the plains. Trade was brisk that summer, Taos merchants bringing salt and chili up from New Mexico, Street Louis freighters bringing rifles, and calico west. The Arkansas Valley was becoming a vein of movement, and Bent's Fort was its beating heart. Hardesty worked among them for a time, shaping traps, curing pelts, trading powder for dried corn. But his thoughts never stayed. Every sunset drew his eyes to the southwest, where the Spanish peaks rose like twin sentinels, their slopes blood-red beneath the last light. The friar's map spoke of two sisters of stone guarding the gate of the treasure. He could not look upon those peaks and not feel the words pressing at him. By mid-July, he was ready to leave. He packed light, one mule for gear, one for provisions, and his horse, a raw-boned sorrel with a habit of biting at the bit. His trade goods he cached beneath a cottonwood north of the fort, rolled in canvas and marked with an X of burnt willow. Then, with the map folded beneath his shirt and his compass dangling from a rawhide string, he crossed the Arkansas at dawn. The first days were easy. The trail followed the Cimarron dry line, where the land rose in long waves toward Raton Pass. Coyotes followed at a distance, silent and lean. He rode by starlight when the heat grew too heavy, the world reduced to silhouettes and the soft thud of hooves. Nights smelled of sage and dust, and the stars were so sharp they seemed to hum. On the third day he found an old fire circle, stones blackened by years. Near it, carved into a sandstone ledge, was a cross with letters below P.S. 1722, the same initials that marked the corner of his friar's map. Hardesty felt his heartbeat quicken. He ran his thumb over the groove and tasted grit. "By God," he whispered, "maybe you weren't so lost after all." He camped there that night, his fire small and his rifle close. The coyotes came nearer, their cries like laughter moving through the grass. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a column of dust marked a small caravan bound for Taos, perhaps Mexican traders, perhaps Comancheros. He did not signal them. Men who roamed these parts under no flag were as likely to slit a throat as share coffee. By morning his mule had gone lame on a cactus spine. He patched it as best he could and pressed on toward the Spanish peaks, now closer, their flanks streaked with veins of red rock. The air began to change, drier, thinner, edged with the smell of pine. He reached the first slopes by evening, where the land gave way to scattered timber and cold springs. There he found another sign, though faint, a circle of stones half buried under moss, and within it a shard of pottery painted with blue glaze. Spanish, surely. The friar's words echoed again, "The valley of the Twin Mountains, where the water runs red and the silver sleeps beneath." Hardesty lit his pipe and stared into the dusk. For the first time, doubt crept in. The peaks loomed vast and old, indifferent to men's stories. Maybe the friar's map was nothing but a dying man's fancy, a last lie told to cheat the grave, but he could not turn back now. Not after all those miles. The next morning he climbed higher, the trail narrowing between basalt cliffs. His horse snorted and shied from shadows. The silence of the place was deep. No wind, no birds, only the creak of leather and the crunch of hooves. Near a cluster of aspens, he found the entrance to a narrow cleft, half choked with rubble. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of metal. He struck a spark and lit a twist of dry grass. The light showed tool marks, old, faint, but unmistakable. A mine, sealed long ago. He crouched, tracing the grooves with his fingers. The stone was red, and when he rubbed it, it left a streak like blood on his skin. Hardesty exhaled slowly. "You weren't lying, Padre," he murmured. Outside, thunder was building over the peaks. He stepped into the light as the first drops fell, fat and cold, raising the smell of wet earth. In the valley below, the Santa Fe Trail lay invisible in haze, a thin thread between worlds. He tightened his hat against the rain, turned toward the dark mouth of the mountain, and felt the old hunger rise again, the same fire that drove men to cross deserts for a whisper of truth. Somewhere in the storm, the mountains answered with a low growl, like the beating heart of the earth itself. And Elias Boone Hardesty, map pressed against his chest, walked forward into the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo, where smoke and salt trails ended and legend began. Winter broke late that year, and the thaw came with thunder. Along the upper purgatoire, the drifts collapsed like dying beasts, and the river ran brown with mountain melt. In the cottonwoods near Raton Creek, Elias Boone Hardesty set up camp beneath a bluff of red stone streaked with quartz veins. The map had led him here, or so he believed. Yet what he found was not silver nor gold, but something stranger, something that burned. The friar's notes, faint in the corners of the parchment, had mentioned fuego bendito, blessed fire. Hardesty at first took it for scripture, the kind of holy talk priests loved to dress in metaphor. But as he scouted the slopes of the Sangre de Cristo, he began to understand it as something else. The rocks here bled resin, black and tarry, from cracks in the cliffside. When he touched flint to it, the stuff hissed and caught, burning blue and slow, a ghostly light that made the stone itself seem alive. He experimented like a man bewitched. By day he hunted mule deer for meat and dried the strips on willow racks. By night he crouched over the glowing fissures, mixing things he barely understood: pine pitch, brimstone scraped from creek beds, the droppings of cave bats that stank of salt and iron. When stirred together, they made a paste that burned hot enough to melt scrap lead from his bullet pouch. He used a broken frying pan as a crucible, and as the mixture flared, the night around him shimmered, green and white. Witch fire, the trappers would later call it. Hell's candlelight. To Hardesty, it was just knowledge raw, dangerous, unclaimed. He thought of Jedediah Smith, who had once mapped half the continent with nothing but a compass and his own stubborn faith. Men called Smith a zealot, too. It was always the same. Anyone who found something new was first named a fool, then a liar, and only later, if he lived long enough, a legend. By early spring, a small party of traders from Taos found his camp. They had come north in search of beaver streams and salt. Among them was a wiry Frenchman with laughing eyes named Baptiste Leclerc, and a quiet mestizo blacksmith, Manuel Ortega, who carried his hammer slung from a leather belt like a gunslinger. Leclerc watched the pale flames licking up the canyon wall and crossed himself. "That ain't right, mon ami," he said. "Rock should not burn like wood." "It ain't the rock," Hardesty replied, stirring the mixture in his pan. "It's what God hid inside it." Ortega knelt beside him, studying the glowing residue. "That's brimstone and guano, see? Same we use to smelt copper down south. You're making poor man's fire, Senor Hardesty. Spaniards once burned like this when they had no forge." Hardesty looked up, sharply. "You've seen this before?" Ortega nodded. "When I was a boy, my father worked near the old mines by Santa Rosa. The Jesuits called it Fuego de los Santos, Fire of the Saints, burned blue, just like yours." The word struck Hardesty like a hammer blow. The friar's blessed fire, the same element that now hissed in his pan, this was no parable. It was the key. That night the three men sat by the river, the flames reflecting in their tin cups. Hardesty unrolled the friar's map and laid it flat on a hide, weighting the corners with stones. The lines were crude, but landmarks leapt out. Las Dos Hermanas, the twin peaks of the Sangre de Cristo, Rio del Fuego, a winding red mark that could only be the Purgatoire, and a cross near the headwaters, labeled simply El Tesoro. Leclerc whistled low. "So this is your ghost treasure. How far do you reckon?" 2 days' climb, maybe 3, Hardesty said. "But I need ore to test the fire. To prove what it can do." Ortega's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "If there's silver in these hills, I can smell it." They spent the next week hunting through gullies and ridges, following veins of red rock until they found a narrow ravine littered with dark stone that sparkled in sunlight. Ortega cracked one with his hammer, sniffed, and nodded. "Galena. Lead, with silver traces. Old too. Someone worked this once." Hardesty set up his crucible at dusk. The wind came down cold from the peaks, carrying snowmelt and pine scent. As the blue flame roared to life, the others stepped back, faces pale. The light poured up the canyon walls, making every shadow dance. When it dimmed, a thin bead of molten metal lay at the bottom of the pan, dull but unmistakable. "Silver," Hardesty said softly. "By God, it's silver." They laughed like madmen, drunk on discovery. Even Leclerc crossed himself again, muttering something about saints and devils. For a brief moment the canyon seemed to hum, with promise, as though the earth itself had spoken. But news traveled faster than they thought. When they came down to Bent's Fort weeks later for supplies, word of the witch fire had already arrived. Some of the trappers mocked him openly. Others spat when he passed, muttering about sorcery and greed. "Best leave them rocks alone," one of Bent's teamsters said. "Ain't natural, what you're stirring up. Spaniards sealed them mines for a reason." Hardesty only smiled. Men fear what they don't understand. Still, the whispers followed him like smoke. A few nights later, someone tried to cut the straps of his pack mule. Ortega caught the thief, one of Cutter's men, and sent him limping into the darkness with a cracked rib. The next morning Hardesty made ready to leave again. He looked back once at the half-finished walls of Bent's Fort, glowing orange in the dawn. Behind those walls lay safety, commerce, civilization of the known world. Ahead, only the peaks, cold and red in the morning sun, their crowns shrouded in mist. He touched the map through his shirt, feeling the brittle paper against his chest. "Fire of the Saints," he whispered. "Let's see if you'll light the way." Then he swung into the saddle, Ortega and Leclerc beside him, and turned toward the high country, where the mountains burned like embers against the sky. The trail swallowed them by noon, and by dusk only the smell of brimstone lingered in the wind. Snow came early to Taos that winter, the kind that lay heavy and wet over the roofs of the adobe town and froze hard by dawn. The streets were little more than ruts of brown ice, where mules slipped and traders cursed in 3 languages. From the chimneys rose the smoke of piñon fires, and above it all the mountains stood white and solemn like old priests. Elias Boone Hardesty had come down from the Sangre de Cristo in November, half-starved and carrying a sack of ore that rattled like bones. The journey had near killed him. Leclerc had gone north to the Platte, chasing rumors of a new beaver run. Ortega had stayed behind, fevered and coughing blood in a crude lean-to near the Red River. By the time Hardesty crossed the Rio Grande, he was alone again, just as he had been when this all began. In Taos, word of his fire in the rocks had spread faster than a prairie wind. Some called him a fool who'd burned his mind on brimstone fumes. Others whispered that he had found the silver mines of the friars and sold his soul to guard them. The town was a magnet for men like that, dreamers, liars, killers, and saints in equal measure. The fur brigades came and went. Traders from Bent's Fort brought robes and powder, and the plaza rang every evening with laughter that was half hunger, half hope. Hardesty rented a small room above the cantina of Don Esteban Salazar, a stout Mexican merchant who'd made his fortune selling cornmeal and whiskey to trappers. He traded his sack of ore for supplies, and spent his nights by lamplight, redrawing the friar's map onto tanned hide. The paper was near ruined from weather and sweat, so he stitched a copy onto the inside of his buffalo coat, tracing each line with a bone needle and lamp-black ink. He didn't trust anyone enough to keep it separate anymore. One night, as he worked, a voice came from the doorway. "You'll go blind doing that by lamplight." Hardesty turned. A man leaned against the jamb, his face familiar young, wiry, with sandy hair and steady eyes that seemed older than the rest of him. "Name's Kit Carson," he said, stepping inside. "Heard you been up in the Sangres. Bent sent word down, said you were chasing ghosts." Hardesty smiled thinly. "Maybe I am. Depends who's telling the tale." Carson pulled up a stool and set his hat on the table. "I've heard worse tales than yours turn out true. Old Bill Williams swears he found Spanish silver once, west of the San Juans, says the ground was so full of red dust it made his boots bleed. Bill Williams sees omens in a mule track," Hardesty said. Carson laughed softly. "Maybe, but he knows country. And he says there's shafts up there timbered, square-cut, not Indian work. Jesuit, maybe. You seen anything like that?" Hardesty nodded slowly. "A cave near the Purgatoire. Cut stone, tool marks. Found slag and crucibles, too, silver traces." Carson's eyes narrowed. "And you aim to go back?" "When spring comes." For a moment neither spoke. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying the faint sound of a drum from the plaza below a Taos dance, wild and ancient, echoing through the cold. Carson leaned forward. "I'll tell you plain, Hardesty. Men die for less than what you're holding. The Mexicans believe the friars cursed those mines, that the ground itself kills those who dig it. You might be chasing treasure, or you might be chasing a grave." Hardesty looked down at the map stitched into his crisis coat, the ink glistening in the lamplight. "I've already buried one partner," he said quietly. "I won't let that be for nothing." Carson studied him a long while, then stood and reached for his hat. "If you need a hand when the snow breaks, come find me. I'll be trapping up near Mora. I don't scare easy, and I've followed fool's gold before." He left with a nod, his boots thudding down the stairs. The door swung shut, and the room fell back into silence, save for the hiss of the lamp. Hardesty leaned back, feeling the weight of the coat on his shoulders. He thought of Ortega coughing blood in that frozen valley, of Leclerc's laughter echoing in the canyons, of the glowing veins in the rock that had whispered like voices when they burned. There was something beneath those peaks, he knew it in his bones. Through the rest of winter he worked as a tinker and gunsmith, mending rifles and shoeing mules. The locals called him El Hombre del Fuego Azul, the man of the blue fire. Children peered through doorways when he passed, and the old women crossed themselves. But the traders, men hardened by hunger and luck, watched him with a different kind of respect. By March he had gathered new companions, a half-Cheyenne scout named Whistler, and a young Delaware boy called Joseph Crane, who could follow tracks through snow like scripture. Together they made plans to head north once the passes cleared. On the morning they left Taos, the sky was bright and brittle. Salazar's wife gave them tortillas and coffee for the trail. Carson appeared at the edge of town, mounted and grinning. "Told you I'd be around," he said. Hardesty smiled. "Then let's see if the ghosts are ready for company." They crossed the Rio Grande under a hawk's shadow and followed the river up toward the mountains, the peaks flashing white in the sun. For 3 days they climbed through pine and shale, past old charcoal pits and forgotten diggings. Each night Hardesty unrolled the map and compared it to the stars. Each day the land seemed to draw them deeper, as though it knew what they sought. On the 4th morning they reached a narrow gorge streaked with red and gray. There, half buried in the talus, stood a row of timbers black with age. Ortega had been right. It was no natural fissure. The entrance to an old mine slanted into the mountain, sealed with rocks and a crude cross carved above it. Carson whistled low. "Looks like the friars knew their business." Hardesty dismounted, brushed snow from the inscription, and whispered, "El Tesoro." The word echoed faintly, swallowed by the dark. He drew a lantern from his pack, struck flint, and watched the flame catch. The blue light flickered over their faces, painting them like spirits. "Saints preserve us," Crane murmured. Hardesty stepped closer to the mouth of the tunnel. "No saints here," he said, "only men and the fire they left behind." Then he ducked under the crossbeam and vanished into the mountain's throat, his lantern's glow trailing after him like the ghost of the old friar's map. The shaft went no deeper than a man could throw a stone, yet it breathed like a living thing. Cold air slid from the darkness in slow pulses, smelling of rust, earth, and something older, salt maybe, or bones. Elias Boone Hardesty held the lantern high and saw where the timbers had caved, crushing the old supports. He brushed a hand over one beam. It was blackened, charred. Fire had been here before, centuries before. Carson crouched behind him, rifle across his knees. "No sign of digging since the friars," he said. "If this ever was a mine, it's been dead a long time." Hardesty nodded, but didn't answer. He was studying the walls, smooth, squared, too neat for natural stone. Near the bottom, something glimmered. He knelt and pried loose a wedge of metal. It was the size of a coin, heavy and dull gray, with the ghost of a stamp on one, beside a royal crest, faint but still proud. "Reales," he murmured. "Spanish coined silver. The friars weren't just praying up here, they were smelting." Carson spat into the dirt. "And dying for it, likely. You see that burn on the beam? Fire took this place. Maybe they brought your witch fire down into the hole and paid for it." Hardesty ran his thumb over the metal's edge. "Then we'll do what they couldn't. We'll finish it." They worked the rest of that day widening the entrance, Whistler and Crane clearing rocks while Carson scouted the ridgeline. By nightfall, the wind howled through the gorge like a pipe organ, and the men built their campfire close. Hardesty mixed a new batch of his brimstone paste in a copper pan, thick and oily. When he lit it, the blue flame flared against the canyon walls, casting every face in ghostlight. Crane crossed himself. "That ain't fire for cooking," he muttered. Hardesty smiled faintly. "It's fire for making. God gave men flint for a reason." When the storm hit at midnight, the snow came sideways, driven hard as gravel. They dragged their gear into the mine's mouth for shelter. The wind moaned through the collapsed timbers like voices. Hardesty dozed fitfully, the map pressed against his chest beneath the hide coat. At dawn, silence. A white world, clean and cold. They packed and prepared to descend again. Carson tied a rawhide rope to a piton and tested the beam. "If that thing gives, we're buried," he said. Hardesty grinned. "Then dig fast." Inside they found the lower tunnel almost intact, arched stone, soot-streaked, the floor littered with splintered crucibles and old slag. In one corner stood a small altar of carved basalt, its surface fused smooth by heat. Embedded in it, half melted, was a silver crucifix. Carson drew a slow breath. "Well, Padre," he whispered to the air, "you left your mark." Hardesty knelt beside the altar, brushing ash away with his glove. "Ortega said the Jesuits made fire of the saints. This is where they did it." He lifted a chunk of slag to the lantern. Inside the rough mass shimmered a vein of pure metal. They were still examining it when the rumble began. A deep tremor shook dust from the ceiling. Then, with a groan like a wounded bull, a beam snapped. The roof came down in sheets. Carson shouted, grabbed Crane by the collar, and dragged him toward the light. Whistler ducked aside, but a rock glanced off his shoulder and sent him sprawling. Hardesty felt a sharp pain in his leg. A beam had fallen across it. The lantern spun, shattered, and the tunnel went black. He clawed at the debris, cursing. The air grew thick with dust. Somewhere near the entrance, Carson's voice rang out faint and desperate. "Elias! Elias! Answer! I'm here!" Hardesty bellowed back. He groped for his knife and cut the leather strap of his pack, freeing one arm. The map, the coat, the oar, none of it mattered. Now. He heaved against the beam, pain seared through his thigh. Then, suddenly, hands were there, Carson's and Crane's, pulling, dragging, half carrying him into the open air. They collapsed together in the snow outside, coughing, blinking against the light. Behind them the mountain exhaled one last sigh and sealed its throat with a cloud of red dust. For a long while no one spoke. Whistler sat clutching his bruised arm, staring at the drift where the mine had been. Carson spat blood and wiped his mouth. "There's your treasure," he said hoarsely. "Buried again." Hardesty lay back, eyes to the sky. The clouds above were the same color as lead. "No," he said quietly. Not buried proved. The ore was there. The fire worked. The friar wasn't lying. Carson gave him a look of disbelief and a bitter smile. "You near got us all killed to prove a dead priest right." "Sometimes that's all a man needs," Hardesty said. They built a rough litter and hauled him down to the foothills, reaching the valley after 2 days. His leg was swollen and black by the time they found shelter in a grove of cottonwoods. Ortega's hammer hung from his belt, a relic he'd kept since the first expedition, and that night he used it one last time. With iron and patience he shaped a crutch from a branch, the blows echoing like a heartbeat in the still air. Each strike rang out across the plain metal on wood, blood on anvil. It was the sound of stubbornness, of men who refused to yield to silence. When at last they reached the Santa Fe Trail, Hardesty could see Bent's Fort far down the horizon, a square of ochre against the sunset. He stopped and turned once more toward the mountains. The peaks burned crimson in the dying light, as if the very rock remembered his fire. He leaned on his crutch and whispered, "You took your silver back, Padre, but you didn't take the truth." Then he faced east again, limping toward the fort and whatever waited. Beyond, the hammer's ring still faint in his ears, half memory, half promise. 2 years passed before Elias Boone Hardesty returned to the mountains. The limp never quite left him, nor the scar that ran from his thigh to his hip where the beam had crushed the flesh. He walked with the stiff patience of a man who'd made peace with pain, and he carried little more than a mule, a pick, and a new partner. The Taos blacksmith Manuel Ortega, gray-bearded now, but steady as an anvil. The friar's map, once hidden in Hardesty's buffalo coat, had been re-inked onto parchment. The edges were singed from campfires, the ink smudged where rain had soaked it, yet the line still led him on the 2 peaks, the river of red, the cross of the treasure. The mine that had nearly buried him was gone, sealed under tons of rock, but he was certain it had been only one of many. In the spring of 1835, they set out north from Taos, following the old Spanish trail that wound through Mora and up the canyons of the Sangre de Cristo. Ortega's pack mules carried sacks of charcoal, tongs, and a small forge, lashed to an iron sledge. Hardesty carried his rifle and the friar's cross, which he'd pried from the collapsed altar 2 years before a charm, a curse, or both. On the 3rd evening, they camped by a stream whose stones shimmered red beneath the moon. Hardesty knelt and washed the cross there, watching how the silver caught the light. Ortega crouched beside him, rolling tobacco with calloused fingers. "You think these hills still hide your padre's silver?" Ortega asked. Hardesty smiled faintly. "If they don't, then I'll find what they meant instead." Ortega chuckled. "Maybe that's the same thing." They pressed higher into the mountains, where the air thinned and the timber gave way to bare rock. They found signs old adits sealed with rubble, half-collapsed smelter pits, and slag that glittered with veins of ore. Once they came upon a carving in the stone, a heart split by a sword, and the letters S. J. Societas Jesu, the mark of the Jesuits. By then, even Ortega grew quiet. "I've seen that sign before," he said. "When I was a boy, they told of a vault hidden when the friars fled the Apaches. They sealed it with prayer and powder both. Said the mountain swallowed the entrance. Then we'll make the mountain spit it back," Hardesty said. For a week they searched the ravines beneath the twin peaks. Then, one dawn, Ortega found a hollow in the rock face, an arch choked with roots and soil. He dug with his pick, and the ground gave a hollow sound. By midday they had uncovered a stone lintel engraved with a cross, and the year 1683. When they pried loose the first slab, cold air poured out air that smelled of dust, wax, and centuries. The space beyond was man-made. Walls of cut stone, the ceiling low enough to brush their heads. Inside lay fragments of wooden crates, rusted tools, and a row of earthen crucibles fused to the floor. Ortega lit a lantern. "Madre de Dios," he whispered. "They were smelting right here." Hardesty knelt beside one of the crucibles and tapped it gently with his hammer. A dull, metallic note answered. He broke off a flake of slag and held it to the light. "Silver and lead both," he said. "They must have pulled the ore from the slope above." In the center of the chamber stood an altar of limestone, blackened by fire. Upon it rested a box of carved cedar bound with iron straps. Ortega's hands trembled as he lifted it. Inside lay a pile of rough ingots, tarnished but unmistakably silver, along with a small leather journal, the writing brown and brittle. Hardesty opened it carefully. The script was Spanish, the hand fine but hurried. He could make out only fragments. "Hermanos, fuego bendito, minas celadas por el Señor." Blessed fire, sealed mines, brothers lost. The friar's own words, Hardesty murmured. He burned his way to salvation. Ortega looked uneasy. Maybe he burned his way to damnation. This place smells of both. They loaded what they could, only a few ingots and the journal, leaving the rest untouched. As they turned to leave, Ortega stopped. "Wait. Listen." From somewhere deeper in the rock came a soft groan, as though the mountain were breathing again. Pebbles trickled down from the ceiling. Hardesty's face tightened. "Move." They ducked out just as a low tremor shook the ground. Behind them, dust belched from the entrance, followed by the dull roar of a partial collapse. Ortega fell to his knees, coughing, his beard powdered white with lime. Hardesty helped him up. "You all right?" "Aye, but the saints just closed their vault again." Hardesty looked back at the blocked archway. Through the dust, faint blue fire still flickered within, like the last breath of something unholy. He touched the crucifix at his neck. "Let them keep. They're silver," he said. "We've got proof enough." They descended the mountain slowly, each step haunted by the groan of settling rock. At camp that night, Ortega melted a pinch of the recovered silver in his forge. The fire burned bright blue, and the molten bead cooled into a perfect sphere. Ortega held it up, shaking his head. "Maybe you're right, Elias. Maybe this fire is blessed." Hardesty watched the blue light fade. "No," he said quietly. "It's cursed, but it's ours." When they rode back to Bent's Fort a month later, the silver hidden in their packs, the plains were greening with summer. The fort's walls gleamed under the sun, bustling now with Cheyenne traders, French voyageurs, and wagon trains bound for Santa Fe. Hardesty dismounted stiffly, his leg aching, and looked at the adobe bastions as if seeing them for the first time. Ortega handed him the silver sphere. "Keep it," he said. "A piece of the mountain to remind you." Hardesty turned it in his palm. It was cold, heavy, and shone faintly with a hue that was not quite white. He slipped it into his pocket and said, "No one will believe it anyway." Ortega smiled. "Maybe not now, but one day someone will." The two men shook hands beneath the fort's gate as the sun sank red over the Arkansas. Behind them, the Sangre de Cristo peaks caught the last light, burning like twin torches against the sky guardians of a secret once lost, now only half remembered. And somewhere beneath those mountains, the fire of the saints still smoldered, waiting for the next fool brave enough to seek it. By the summer of 1836, Bent's Fort was no longer a frontier outpost, it was a kingdom of mud walls and noise. Traders, trappers, Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Mexicans came and went in a river of barter and dust. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer mixed with the shouts of wagon masters and the cry of mules. The air smelled of buffalo hides, gun oil, and sweat, and above the gate fluttered a ragged American flag, more ambition than authority. Elias Boone Hardesty limped through the fort's courtyard, the sun burning the top of his hat. He'd come back with proof, the silver ingots and the friar's journal, but he carried them quiet, hidden in his pack beneath sacks of beaver pelts. Men around here killed for less. He found Charles Bent near the trade store, arguing with a freighter over flour prices. When Bent saw Hardesty, he grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "By thunder, I thought the hills ate you. Carson said you'd gone under for good." "Not yet," Hardesty said. "And I brought something worth your whiskey." Bent laughed. "You always bring stories, Elias. Let's hear this one." Inside the fort's cool adobe room, Hardesty laid a single ingot on the table. The metal caught the lantern light like frozen water. Beside it he placed the friar's book, open to the page where the script still shimmered. Faintly under soot, "Fuego bendito la mina celada por el Señor." Bent whistled low. "I'll be damned, you found it." "Found part of it," Hardesty said. "The mountain swallowed the rest." Bent turned the silver in his hands, weighing it. "And how much more of this lies up there?" "Enough to build another fort," Hardesty said. "But it's sealed by cave-ins. You'd need months of men and powder to open it." Bent leaned back, eyes narrowing. "That can be arranged." Hardesty frowned. "This isn't a trading post venture, Charlie. The ground's cursed. It's not meant for greed." Bent's grin thinned. "Cursed or not, silver spends. You've done the hard part, found the vein. Let me handle the rest." Before Hardesty could answer, a voice came from the doorway. "If there's talk of silver, you might want to speak softer." It was Ephraim Cutter, one of the fort's American traders, sharp-eyed, red-bearded, and mean as a starving wolf. Cutter had the kind of smile that cut both ways. He'd lost 3 men to the Comanches the year before, and blamed every Mexican and half-breed he met. Bent waved him off. "Mind your business, F." Cutter stepped inside anyway, eyes flicking to the ingot on the table. "That your find, Hardesty? Heard whispers of your witch fire. Thought it was just talk." Hardesty slid the ingot back into his pack. "It still is. But the damage was done." Cutter's eyes gleamed with calculation. "Silver don't lie. You should know better than to show treasure where hungry men drink." He left with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That night the fort buzzed like a kicked anthill. Men whispered of Hardesty's mountain fire and of lost Spanish mines that could make a king rich. Hardesty drank alone in the corner of the courtyard, watching the lamps flicker through the smoky haze. He saw Cutter speaking with a pair of rough hands from the Arkansas outfit, their faces shadowed. By dawn, the mules were gone, 2 of Hardesty's and 1 of Ortega's. The gate guard swore no one had passed, but the tracks were clear. 3 riders heading south. "Cutter's doing." Hardesty found Bent near the smithy, hammering nails. "He's taken my mules and likely heading for the Sangres." Bent's jaw tightened. "Ephraim's a fool, but a dangerous one. I'll send men after him." "I'll go myself," Hardesty said. Bent started to protest, but the look in Hardesty's eyes stopped him. "Then take Carson with you," he said quietly. "He's out by the river, and Elias, don't let that silver turn, you mean." Hardesty rode out within the hour, his leg aching, the sun already high. Carson joined him near the crossing, rifle slung, eyes sharp. "So Cutter's chasing your ghosts, eh?" "He's welcome to them," Hardesty said grimly. "But if he finds the vault, he won't come back down alive." They followed the trail 3 days across, the plains, and into the foothills. The Sangre de Cristo loomed ahead, their peaks blushing red at dusk. On the 4th day they found the mules grazing near a stream and Cutter's camp not far off. Smoke rose thinly from a fire, and beside it lay a pack open wide, filled with Hardesty's own gear, the friar's book among it. Cutter was bent over the parchment, reading by firelight. "So it's true," he said without looking up. "You were sitting on a fortune while the rest of us scraped beaver pelts." Hardesty leveled his rifle. "Put it down, F." Cutter smiled, slow and cruel. "You can't own a map to heaven and not share it, Elias. That ain't Christian." Carson moved behind him, silent as smoke. "Don't make me send you there to argue it," he said. Cutter's hand twitched toward his pistol. The next sound was one shot, sharp and final. He fell sideways into the fire, eyes wide, the flames licking at his beard. The journal fluttered from his hand into the dirt. Carson kicked sand over the fire. "You didn't have to kill him," he said quietly. "He made the choice," Hardesty replied. He bent, retrieved the friar's book, and brushed off the ash. Men don't listen to warnings until it's too late. They buried Cutter in a shallow grave by the stream and covered him with stones. As the wind swept down from the peaks, Hardesty looked up toward the red mountains and said, "That's the last man who'll die for this." Carson didn't answer. The snow line glowed faint in the distance, and the peaks caught the evening sun, blazing with the same strange fire that had driven Hardesty for years. When they rode back toward the plains, Bent's Fort lay somewhere beyond the horizon, its walls no more than a rumor. The lost mines would stay buried now, sealed under legend and blood. Hardesty touched the friar's journal once more before tucking it away. "Let the fools keep their gold rushes," he muttered. "Some fires burn better when left alone." The wind carried the scent of rain and sage, and behind him, in the high country, the mountains smoldered in the dying light, silent witnesses to the curse of discovery. By the time the year 1838 rolled across the plains, most men had forgotten Elias Boone Hardesty. Bent's Fort had grown into a small empire, its walls higher, its traders richer, its tales taller. New faces filled the courtyard now, young and restless, bound west for fortune. To them, the old trapper with the limp was just another relic of a wilder age. But among the few who remembered, his story had begun to shift part truth, part ghost talk. Around campfires they told of the blue fire that burned in the Sangre de Cristo mountains, of a hidden vault where friars and trappers alike had met their end. Some said Hardesty had struck silver and buried it again. Others swore he'd gone mad, calling down spirits to guard his claim. Hardesty himself said little. He lived in a small cabin upriver from Bent's Fort, half hermit, half blacksmith. The hammering of his forge echoed across the flats like a heartbeat in the dust. He still kept Ortega's iron hammer by his side and the friar's cross above the door. At night, when the wind came off the mountains, he could smell brimstone faint but real, as if the fire he'd unleashed years ago still breathed somewhere under the stone. He'd dreamed of it too often to doubt it. In those dreams, the friar's face emerged from smoke, lips moving without sound, and behind him the mountains glowed like burning altars. That autumn, Kit Carson rode in from the north. He found Hardesty at the forge, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat streaking his weathered face. "Still working the devil's fire, Elias?" Carson asked. Hardesty smiled without looking up. "Forge don't judge who swings the hammer." Carson dismounted, dusting off his coat. "Heard talk downriver. Trappers saw light. Near the Spanish peaks blue, like lightning under the ground. They say it's your witch fire again." Hardesty paused, the hammer hanging midair. "The ground don't forget, Kit. Maybe it's just remembering." Carson studied him a moment, the same wary sympathy in his eyes that he'd carried since Taos. "You ever think about going back? See what's really burning up there?" Hardesty shook his head. "No. Some things you find once. Twice, they find you." They shared a meal that night, coffee thick as tar, bread baked on coals. Carson spoke of new trade routes, of settlers pushing deeper into the Rockies, of the world changing faster than any man could follow. Hardesty listened, silent, staring into the fire. When Carson finally rose to leave, he said, "You're part of these hills now, Elias. Folks'll talk about you long after your forge goes cold." Hardesty chuckled softly. "Let them. Maybe they'll remember the fire, not the fool who lit it." 2 winters. Later, a snowstorm swept the Arkansas Valley. When spring thaw came, traders found Hardesty's cabin half buried in drift, the forge cold, the door open to the wind. Inside they found the friar's cross hanging above the hearth, his rifle leaning by the wall, and his boots beside the bed. But of Hardesty himself no sign. Only his hammer lay on the anvil, the metal fused to the head as if struck by lightning. For years afterward, travelers through the upper plains claimed to see strange lights on stormy nights, blue flickers along the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo. Old trappers would nod and say, "That's Hardesty's fire, burnin' still. He never quit the forge, just moved it under the mountain." At Bent's Fort, the story grew with every retelling. Some said he'd joined the friars' ghosts, guarding their silver until Judgment Day. Others believed he'd found a new vein and sealed it again to keep the world honest. And every now and then a prospector passing through would claim to have found fragments of slag in the high canyon slag that glowed faintly blue when struck by moonlight. The young men laughed, called it campfire talk. But the old ones, the ones who'd seen the fire with their own eyes, just stared west when the sun set red over the plains. Because out there, where the Twin Peaks caught the last light and turned it blood and cobalt, the mountains still kept their secret. And the legend of Elias Boone Hardesty, the man of the blue fire, the last of the old breed, lived on in the whisper of wind over stone, in the ring of a distant hammer that never quite died away. And sometimes, on the stillest nights, when the air was sharp with snow and silence, a pale glow would shimmer against the dark horizon, like a forge hidden inside the earth, reminding all who saw it that the frontier had never truly gone cold.